The happiest brides walk toward love. I walk toward a man the entire city feared. Amelia Brooks repeated those words silently as the heavy wooden doors of Blackwood Manor opened before her, each step echoing louder than the last. At 26 years old, she had imagined countless versions of her wedding day, but none of them involved marrying the mysterious mafia boss whose name inspired whispered conversations and cautious glances throughout New York. She had accepted the arrangement only because it was the one choice that could protect the people she loved. Every newspaper had painted Ethan Blackwood as an untouchable man who controlled entire industries with cold precision, while every rumor described him as someone incapable of kindness. Amelia had spent weeks preparing herself for a life without freedom, convinced that behind the polished marble walls of his estate waited endless rules, endless silence, and endless loneliness. The grand entrance hall looked more like a museum than a home, filled with warm light reflecting across polished floors, elegant artwork, and fresh white flowers instead of the dark atmosphere she expected. Staff members greeted her politely with respectful smiles, making her wonder whether they were simply pretending because their employer demanded perfection. She tried not to let her surprise show. Her heart still raced as she followed the house manager through long hallways until they stopped before a pair of carved oak doors. She took a slow breath, expecting her new husband to establish impossible rules the moment she entered. Instead, Ethan Blackwood stood beside a large window overlooking the rain, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit. He turned calmly as she entered, his expression unreadable yet composed. He did not step closer. He did not reach for her hand. He simply looked at her for several quiet seconds before speaking in a steady voice. "Welcome home, Amelia." The words caught her completely off guard. Home was the last word she expected to hear. She forced herself to answer politely, waiting for the commands that surely would follow. Instead, Ethan handed her a simple silver key. "This opens your private suite. No one enters without your permission." Amelia stared at the key in confusion. "My private suite?" she asked carefully. Ethan nodded once. "Your room, your office if you wish, your library if you prefer. Arrange it however you like." She blinked, unsure whether she had misunderstood him. "There are no restrictions?" Ethan looked toward the rain again before answering. "Only one. You should always feel safe here." The sentence unsettled her even more than a threat would have. Every warning she had ever heard about him suddenly felt impossible to match with the quiet man standing before her. Throughout dinner he remained courteous, asking about her education, her favorite books, and the places she hoped to visit one day. He never mentioned obedience. He never mentioned expectations. He never even referred to their marriage as an obligation. Every answer Amelia gave was cautious because she believed this unexpected kindness had to be part of a carefully planned test. After the meal, Ethan stood and said, "You have had a long day. Get some rest. Tomorrow you may explore the estate if you would like." Before leaving, he paused near the doorway without turning around. "One more thing," he said softly. "No one in this house will force you to become someone you are not." Amelia watched him disappear into the hallway, her thoughts spinning faster than ever. The monster she had prepared herself to survive had not appeared. In his place stood a man who seemed determined to give her space, dignity, and peace. Alone in her room, she looked at the silver key resting in her hand and realized that the greatest fear she carried into Blackwood Manor was slowly being replaced by a far more dangerous feeling: curiosity. As thunder rolled quietly beyond the windows, Amelia found herself asking a question she never imagined she would ask. If every story about Ethan Blackwood had been wrong, then what truth had been hidden all along? Morning sunlight spilled across the tall windows of Blackwood Manor, painting golden reflections over polished hardwood floors that still felt unfamiliar to Amelia Brooks. She woke expecting to remember the previous evening as a strange dream, but the silver key resting on the nightstand reminded her that everything had been real. She dressed quietly and stepped into the hallway, determined to discover whether Ethan Blackwood's unexpected kindness had simply been a carefully staged performance. Every employee she passed greeted her with genuine warmth, never with nervousness or fear. They addressed her respectfully, without forcing awkward conversation, allowing her to move through the estate at her own pace. The atmosphere felt organized, calm, and surprisingly welcoming. It was nothing like the prison she had imagined during the weeks leading to the wedding. After breakfast, the house manager handed Amelia a beautifully bound notebook. Inside were maps of the estate, contact numbers for every department, and a handwritten note from Ethan. It read, "You may go wherever you wish on the property. If you need anything, simply ask. No permission is required." Amelia read the sentence twice before closing the notebook. She almost laughed at the irony. The more freedom he offered, the more suspicious she became. Every instinct warned her that nobody with his reputation behaved this way without a hidden reason. She spent the morning exploring the gardens, the library, and the glass conservatory filled with flowers from around the world. Everywhere she went, she noticed quiet signs of thoughtful planning. Comfortable benches overlooked peaceful ponds. Reading lamps stood beside every chair in the library. Fresh fruit and bottled water were placed throughout the estate for guests and employees alike. The details suggested someone who anticipated the needs of others long before they asked. Late that afternoon, Amelia wandered into a spacious music room where sunlight rested softly across an elegant grand piano. She lightly touched the polished surface, remembering childhood lessons she had abandoned years earlier. Before she could step away, a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "You play?" Ethan asked calmly. Amelia turned, slightly startled. "I used to," she admitted. "Not very well." Ethan walked no closer than necessary, respecting the distance between them. "There is no audience here," he said with a faint smile. "Only an instrument waiting to be heard again." She hesitated before sitting at the piano bench. Her fingers slowly found a simple melody she had not played in years. A few notes stumbled, but she continued until the tune flowed naturally. When she finished, the room became quiet once more. Ethan nodded with sincere appreciation. "You should keep playing," he said. "Some parts of ourselves deserve a second chance." Before Amelia could respond, an assistant entered carrying a stack of business folders. Ethan excused himself politely. "Duty calls," he said. "Dinner will be served at 7 if you wish to join me. If not, the kitchen will prepare whatever you prefer." Then he left without waiting for an answer. Amelia remained seated at the piano, replaying every conversation they had shared since arriving. He had never ordered her to do anything. He had never raised his voice. He had never reminded her that this marriage had been arranged against her wishes. Instead, he spoke to her as though her choices genuinely mattered. That evening, curiosity quietly overcame caution. She accepted the dinner invitation. Their conversation drifted from architecture to travel, from favorite novels to childhood memories. Ethan listened carefully whenever she spoke, asking thoughtful questions but never pressing into subjects she avoided. As the meal ended, Amelia realized something that unsettled her even more than fear ever had. She no longer spent every moment waiting for his true nature to appear. Instead, she found herself wondering whether the world had judged Ethan Blackwood without ever taking the time to know the man behind the name. Several days passed with a quiet rhythm that Amelia Brooks never expected to find inside Blackwood Manor. Every morning began with breakfast served in the bright sunroom overlooking acres of carefully maintained gardens, and every evening ended with calm conversations that somehow made the enormous estate feel a little less unfamiliar. Yet the greatest mystery remained Ethan himself. The more time she spent observing him, the less he resembled the ruthless figure described by newspapers and rumors. Instead of commanding attention, through fear, he earned respect through consistency, patience, and discipline. Amelia began noticing details that most visitors would probably overlook. Every employee, from the gardeners to the executive assistants, greeted Ethan without hesitation. They were professional, but they were never frightened. He remembered birthdays, asked about recovering family members, and thanked people for even the smallest accomplishments. One afternoon, she watched him stop an important meeting simply to congratulate a longtime groundskeeper who had completed 20 years of service. Rather than offering an expensive gift, Ethan presented the man with a framed photograph of the estate taken on the employee's very first day of work alongside a handwritten letter expressing genuine gratitude. The older man struggled to hide tears, and everyone in the room applauded with sincere admiration. Amelia quietly stepped away before anyone noticed her watching. That simple moment unsettled every assumption she still carried. Later that week, Amelia visited the library intending to borrow another novel, but she found Ethan standing near one of the tall shelves reading through a thick architectural book. He looked up with a relaxed smile as she approached. "Finding anything interesting?" he asked. Amelia hesitated before answering honestly. "I think I am still trying to understand this house." Ethan closed the book gently. "Most people only notice its size," he replied. "Very few notice why it was built this way." Curious despite herself, Amelia followed him through a long hallway that connected the oldest wing of the manor to a newly renovated section filled with sunlight. Large windows overlooked gardens instead of stone walls. Comfortable reading corners appeared every few rooms. Family photographs belonging to longtime employees decorated several corridors rather than portraits celebrating wealth or power. Ethan explained that he believed a home should help people breathe more easily after difficult days. Amelia listened silently, surprised by the quiet sincerity in his voice. Nothing sounded rehearsed. Nothing felt designed to impress her. It simply sounded like a man describing values he genuinely believed. As they reached another hallway, Amelia noticed a single wooden door unlike every other entrance in the manor. It was elegant but noticeably older, with a polished brass handle that reflected the afternoon light. There was no nameplate, no decoration, and no visible lock from the outside, yet something about it immediately caught her attention. Ethan's footsteps slowed for the first time that day. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a sadness Amelia had not seen before. After a brief silence, he spoke softly. "Some rooms are easier to leave closed until the right time." He offered no further explanation and gently guided the conversation toward dinner plans as though nothing unusual had happened. Amelia respected the unspoken boundary, but her curiosity quietly deepened. That evening she stood alone on the balcony outside her room, watching city lights shimmer beyond the distant trees while replaying every conversation they had shared. The mansion no longer felt cold, yet one unanswered question lingered in her heart. If Ethan Blackwood had nothing to hide, why did one single door seem to hold a story even he was not ready to tell? The image of the old wooden door remained in Amelia Brooks's thoughts long after that quiet walk through the manor. She told herself it was none of her business, yet every unanswered question seemed to grow louder with each passing day. Rather than searching for the truth herself, she chose patience, believing that trust could never be built by forcing open doors that someone else had carefully kept closed. Life inside Blackwood Manor continued with an unexpected sense of normalcy. Every morning Ethan Blackwood left early for meetings across the city, returning each evening with the same calm expression and the same habit of asking whether Amelia had discovered anything interesting that day. Their conversations gradually became more natural. They debated classic novels over dinner, laughed about childhood memories that neither of them had expected to share, and occasionally spent quiet evenings in the library reading separate books without feeling the need to fill every silence with conversation. Amelia slowly realized that silence around Ethan never felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. One rainy afternoon, she decided to help organize a charity event that the Blackwood Foundation sponsored every year for local youth education programs. Expecting to find a team of outside organizers, Amelia was surprised to discover that Ethan personally reviewed every scholarship application before approving the final list. He spent hours reading letters from students, making handwritten notes beside each file instead of simply signing documents prepared by someone else. When Amelia asked why he invested so much time into the process, Ethan answered without looking up from the papers. "Every name belongs to a real person. They deserve more than a quick decision." His response lingered in Amelia's mind for the rest of the afternoon. Later, during the charity event itself, Ethan blended quietly into the background while volunteers received the recognition. Parents thanked the foundation, students celebrated new opportunities, and community leaders praised the program, yet Ethan never stepped onto the stage to accept applause. He remained near the entrance, greeting guests one by one and making certain every family felt welcome. Amelia watched from across the room as several children excitedly ran toward him. Instead of acting distant, he knelt to their eye level, listened carefully to their stories, and encouraged them to continue chasing their dreams. There was no audience to impress and no cameras focused on him in that moment. His kindness appeared completely effortless. During the drive back to the estate, Amelia looked through the car window as city lights reflected across the rain-covered streets. Finally, she asked the question that had quietly followed her for days. Why do you let everyone else stand in the spotlight when the foundation belongs to you? Ethan smiled faintly before answering. If people remember the opportunities they received instead of the person who paid for them, then the purpose was fulfilled. Amelia could not think of a response. The answer sounded too genuine to question. That evening, as they entered the manor, Ethan was called away by an urgent phone conversation with one of his senior advisors. He apologized politely before excusing himself, leaving Amelia alone in the grand hallway. While waiting, she noticed an elderly housekeeper carefully dusting a framed photograph resting on a nearby table. The woman smiled warmly when Amelia approached. "He keeps that picture here because it reminds him of the promise he made," she said without thinking. Before Amelia could ask what promise she meant, the housekeeper suddenly realized she had spoken aloud and quickly changed the subject. Amelia glanced at the photograph, but the frame had been turned slightly away, making the faces impossible to recognize. For the second time, she found herself standing before another quiet mystery connected to Ethan. Between the forgotten room upstairs and the unfinished sentence she had just heard, Amelia became certain that the man the world believed it knew was carrying a story far deeper than anyone had ever imagined. The quiet mysteries surrounding Ethan Blackwood no longer filled Amelia Brooks with fear. Instead, they awakened a growing desire to understand the man hidden behind every unanswered question. Days turned into weeks, and the unfamiliar routine of Blackwood Manor slowly became comforting. Amelia found herself looking forward to their evening dinners, where conversations wandered naturally from favorite childhood memories to ambitious dreams neither of them had spoken aloud in years. Ethan always listened more than he spoke, giving every answer careful attention as though each word carried genuine importance. One crisp autumn morning, Amelia volunteered to help prepare the manor for the Foundation's annual appreciation luncheon honoring teachers, firefighters, medical workers, and community volunteers. The estate buzzed with quiet excitement as employees arranged flowers, polished silverware, and welcomed guests from across the city. Amelia worked alongside everyone else without ceremony, surprising many of the staff by insisting that she wanted to contribute rather than simply observe. During the preparations, she noticed Ethan carrying boxes of supplies into the ballroom himself, despite several employees offering to do the work. "You do not have to lift those," Amelia said with a smile. Ethan shrugged lightly. "Neither do you, yet here we are." She laughed before either of them realized how naturally the moment had unfolded. It was the first time laughter had filled the space between them without hesitation. Throughout the afternoon, Amelia observed Ethan greeting every guest by name whenever possible. He remembered personal details from conversations months earlier, asked about recovering parents, congratulated teachers on successful school programs, and thanked volunteers individually instead of delivering polished speeches. More than once, Amelia caught herself smiling simply because everyone around him seemed genuinely comfortable. As the event ended, light rain began falling across the gardens. Guests hurried toward waiting cars while staff members quickly gathered decorations before the weather grew heavier. Amelia insisted on helping move flower arrangements from the outdoor terrace despite the steady drizzle. By the time everything had been brought inside, her hair and jacket were soaked. She dismissed it with a laugh, claiming she had experienced much worse weather growing up. Ethan looked at her for a brief moment before quietly asking one of the housekeepers to prepare hot tea and dry towels. Amelia barely noticed until later that evening when a slight headache settled behind her eyes. By bedtime, she felt chilled despite the warmth of her room. She woke several hours later with a mild fever and tried convincing herself it was nothing serious. The following morning, she attempted to join breakfast as usual, but the moment Ethan saw her pale face, he gently set aside the newspaper he had been reading. "You are not feeling well," he said with calm certainty. Amelia offered a weak smile. "It is only a small cold." Ethan shook his head. Small problems become larger when people pretend they do not exist. Without raising his voice or making the situation dramatic, he postponed his morning meetings, asked the family physician to visit the estate, and personally carried a tray of warm soup, fresh fruit, tea, and medicine to Amelia's room. He knocked before entering and waited for her permission instead of assuming he could walk inside simply because they were married. As she thanked him, Ethan placed everything carefully beside the bed and adjusted the curtains so soft daylight filled the room without becoming uncomfortable. "Rest today," he said quietly. "The world can wait until tomorrow." Amelia watched him prepare to leave before asking the question that had unexpectedly formed in her heart. "Why are you always so considerate?" Ethan paused with one hand resting on the doorknob. After several thoughtful seconds, he answered without turning around. "Because I know how much one act of kindness can change someone's entire life." The door closed gently behind him, leaving Amelia alone with those simple words. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, she stopped searching for hidden motives behind his actions. Instead, she found herself wondering what experience had taught Ethan Blackwood a lesson that seemed to guide every quiet decision he made. Amelia Brooks recovered quickly, but the quiet conversation outside her bedroom door stayed with her far longer than the fever itself. Ethan Blackwood had spoken only one sentence before leaving, yet it echoed through her thoughts every day. Someone had once changed his life with a single act of kindness. She could not stop wondering who that person had been or why the memory still seemed to shape every decision he made. A week later, the manor settled back into its familiar rhythm. One peaceful afternoon, Amelia visited the library while Ethan attended a meeting in the east wing of the estate. She wandered through rows of books until she noticed the elderly housekeeper organizing a collection of old family albums. The woman smiled warmly and invited Amelia to help dust the shelves. As they worked together, an aged envelope slipped from between two books and landed softly on the floor. Amelia bent to pick it up, intending to return it immediately, but she noticed that it had never been sealed. Before she could look away, a single handwritten sentence caught her attention. A promise should never depend on time. Realizing it belonged to Ethan, she quickly handed the letter back without reading another word. The housekeeper accepted it with a gentle smile instead of concern. "He wrote that many years ago," she said quietly. "Some promises become part of a person's heart." Amelia wanted to ask more, but the woman simply placed the envelope inside the album and carefully returned it to the shelf. That evening, Ethan invited Amelia to take a walk through the gardens before dinner. Autumn leaves drifted slowly across the stone pathways as the setting sun painted the sky with warm shades of gold and crimson. They spoke comfortably about ordinary things until they reached the peaceful pond near the far edge of the property. Ethan stopped beside the water and looked across its perfectly still surface. "There is something I should tell you," he said after a long silence. Amelia waited patiently without interrupting. "This marriage was never arranged because I wanted power," Ethan continued. "It was never about business, reputation, or appearances." Amelia looked at him with quiet surprise. Ethan took a slow breath before continuing. "Several years ago, before either of us knew each other, your father helped someone without asking for anything in return. Most people never learned what he did because he believed kindness should remain private. I happened to be the person he helped." Amelia stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking. He was not. "When I learned your family was facing impossible circumstances, I remembered his generosity. I could not repay him directly anymore. So I chose the only path that would guarantee your family's safety while protecting your independence at the same time." Amelia struggled to process his words. Every assumption she had carried since the wedding suddenly began falling apart. "You could have simply offered financial help," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I tried. Your father refused every offer before he passed away. He believed your family deserved dignity, not charity." His voice remained calm, yet Amelia sensed genuine respect in every word. "The marriage agreement allowed me to protect what mattered to him without taking away your family's pride." Tears quietly gathered in Amelia's eyes as she realized that the sacrifice she had believed was forced upon her had actually been built upon a promise of gratitude and respect. Ethan looked toward the fading sunset before speaking one final sentence. "I never expected you to love me, Amelia. I only hoped that one day you would understand why I could not walk away from a debt that kindness created." As they slowly walked back toward the manor beneath the first evening stars, Amelia no longer saw herself as a reluctant bride trapped inside an unfamiliar life. For the first time, she understood that every unexpected act of patience, every quiet kindness, and every freedom Ethan had given her had never been part of a performance. They had been the faithful fulfillment of a promise he had carried silently in his heart for years. The truth Ethan Blackwood had shared transformed everything Amelia Brooks believed about the life they had unexpectedly built together. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, she stopped seeing herself as someone trapped by circumstances and began seeing the quiet intention behind every thoughtful decision he had made. The following days carried a different feeling. The halls of the manor seemed warmer, their conversations came more naturally, and even the long silences between them felt comfortable instead of uncertain. Amelia found herself smiling without realizing it whenever Ethan entered a room. One bright Saturday morning, she joined him for breakfast overlooking the gardens where autumn leaves danced gently across the lawn. As they finished their coffee, Ethan placed a small folder beside her plate. "There is something I would like you to review," he said calmly. Amelia opened the folder and found documents transferring complete management of one of the Blackwood Foundation's educational programs into her hands. She looked up in surprise. "You trust me with this?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "I trust your judgment more than my own in matters that change people's everyday lives." Amelia studied him carefully, expecting some hidden condition attached to the responsibility. There was none. "You may accept it," Ethan continued, "or decline it. The decision is entirely yours." Once again, he left the choice completely in her hands. Over the next several weeks, Amelia devoted herself to the foundation. She visited schools, met with teachers, listened to students, and worked alongside community leaders to improve scholarship opportunities. Ethan never interfered with her decisions. Instead, he quietly supported every idea she proposed, offering advice only when she specifically asked for it. Watching him encourage her independence rather than control, it slowly reshaped the way she viewed both their marriage and herself. One afternoon, after returning from a successful meeting with local educators, Amelia walked through the manor searching for Ethan. She eventually found him alone in the library, reviewing architectural plans for another community center the foundation hoped to build. Without thinking, she placed a cup of fresh coffee beside him exactly the way he preferred it. Ethan looked up with mild surprise before smiling warmly. "Thank you," he said. Amelia smiled back. "You remembered my favorite tea before I ever mentioned it. I suppose I can remember your coffee." Their eyes met for a quiet moment that neither of them hurried to end. It was not an awkward silence. It was the comfortable understanding that only grows between two people who have begun to truly know one another. Later that evening, while organizing foundation reports together, Ethan closed one of the files and spoke with unusual seriousness. "Amelia, there is something important you should know." She listened carefully. "If you ever decide this life is not the one you want, every legal document has already been prepared. You are free to leave whenever you choose. Your family's future will remain secure exactly as promised. Nothing will be taken away." Amelia stared at him, unable to believe what she had just heard. "You would let me walk away?" Ethan nodded gently. "A promise loses its meaning if it depends on someone's obligation to stay." His words filled the room with quiet honesty. He was offering complete freedom, even though it might cost him the person he had silently cared for all along. That night, Amelia stood alone on the balcony outside her room, looking across the peaceful lights surrounding the estate. She realized that the greatest difference between the frightened woman who had arrived weeks earlier and the person she had become was not the manor, the marriage, or even the truth she had recently learned. It was the simple fact that she no longer remained because she believed she had no choice. Deep within her heart, a quiet realization finally emerged. For the first time since the wedding, Amelia Brooks wanted to stay because being beside Ethan Blackwood had begun to feel less like fulfilling an arrangement and more like finding the place where she truly belonged. Amelia Brooks could no longer pretend that her feelings had not changed. The fear that had followed her through the gates of Blackwood Manor had quietly disappeared, replaced by a sense of peace she had never expected to find. Every day spent beside Ethan Blackwood revealed another reason to admire the man hidden beneath the reputation the world had created for him. He remained thoughtful without seeking praise, generous without expecting recognition, and respectful without asking for anything in return. Yet despite the happiness slowly growing between them, Amelia noticed a quiet distance Ethan continued to keep. He never assumed that her growing comfort meant her heart belonged to him. Instead, he honored the freedom he had promised from the very beginning. One afternoon, while reviewing scholarship applications together in the library, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from one of his senior advisors. His calm expression became more serious as he listened, though he never raised his voice. After ending the conversation, he closed the folder in front of him and looked toward Amelia with quiet sincerity. "There is something I need to tell you before you hear it from someone else," he said. Amelia nodded, sensing that the conversation carried unusual weight. Ethan explained that an influential international investment group had offered to form a partnership with the Blackwood Foundation, but the proposal came with one condition. They believed the foundation would appear more independent if Amelia publicly stepped away from the marriage and accepted a leadership position under her own name. The agreement would dramatically expand educational opportunities across the country and provide thousands of additional scholarships every year. Amelia listened in stunned silence. "What did you tell them?" she asked softly. Ethan met her eyes without hesitation. "I told them I would never decide your future for you." He placed the proposal on the table between them. "If accepting their offer is the life you truly want, I will sign every document necessary to make it happen. The foundation will continue receiving my full financial support, and no one will ever know the reason behind your decision unless you choose to tell them." Amelia stared at him, hardly believing what she was hearing. Once again, Ethan was placing her happiness above his own. He was prepared to lose the woman he loved if it meant giving her an opportunity she might value more. That evening, Amelia walked alone through the gardens, replaying every memory from the day she had arrived at the manor until this very moment. She remembered the silver key placed gently into her hand, the freedom he had offered without hesitation, the kindness shown to every employee, the promise he had fulfilled for her father, and the countless small gestures that had slowly rebuilt her understanding of trust. None of those moments had been driven by obligation. They had all come from the same quiet heart that now stood willing to let her leave if it meant protecting her future. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees, Amelia realized that love was not measured by possession. It was measured by the courage to place another person's happiness before one's own. She returned to the manor just as Ethan finished another meeting. He looked at her with the same calm expression he always wore, never asking what decision she had made. Amelia walked toward him until only a few feet separated them. With a gentle smile, she picked up the partnership proposal from the nearby table, folded it carefully, and handed it back to him. "There is something I finally understand," she said quietly. Ethan waited in silence. Amelia's eyes filled with quiet emotion as she continued. "The greatest gift you have ever given me was never this house, this foundation, or even the freedom to leave. It was making sure every choice I made truly belonged to me." For the first time since they had met, Ethan's composed expression softened completely. Neither of them spoke another word. In that peaceful silence, Amelia realized her heart had already made the only decision that truly mattered. The quiet smile Amelia Brooks offered that evening became the beginning of a completely different chapter in both of their lives. Nothing changed overnight, yet everything felt different. There was no dramatic declaration and no grand celebration. Instead, the days that followed were filled with countless small moments that quietly transformed an arranged marriage into a relationship built upon trust, friendship, and genuine affection. Ethan Blackwood remained exactly who he had always been, thoughtful, patient, and respectful, but Amelia no longer questioned the kindness behind his actions. She accepted them with gratitude instead of suspicion, and before long she found herself returning those same quiet acts of care without even realizing it. Morning coffee was already waiting in Ethan's study before his meetings began. Fresh flowers appeared in the library because Amelia noticed how sunlight reflected beautifully across the shelves. Evening dinners became longer as they lingered over conversations about future projects, favorite memories, and hopes they had never dared to share with anyone else. Their home gradually became filled with laughter instead of uncertainty. Several months later, the Blackwood Foundation celebrated the opening of its newest education center, a project Amelia had personally helped design from the very beginning. Hundreds of students and families gathered for the ceremony, yet just as before, Ethan quietly stood among the guests rather than at the center of attention. When reporters approached Amelia asking how such an ambitious project had become possible, she smiled warmly before answering. It began with someone who believed that kindness should never expect recognition. Ethan heard her words from across the courtyard and lowered his eyes with a modest smile. That evening, After the celebration ended, Amelia invited Ethan to walk through the gardens where they had shared so many important conversations. The same pond reflected the stars above, and the familiar pathways glowed beneath soft lantern light. They stopped at the very place where Ethan had once revealed the truth about her father. Amelia reached into her coat pocket and removed the small silver key he had given her on the first day she entered Blackwood Manor. She gently placed it in his hand before closing his fingers around it. Ethan looked at her with quiet confusion. Amelia smiled through eyes filled with emotion. "The first time you gave me this key, you were opening a door so I could feel safe. Today I want to give it back because this house no longer feels like a place I was brought to. It feels like the home I chose." Ethan looked at the key for several silent moments before shaking his head gently. He reopened her hand and placed it back into her palm. "Keep it," he said softly. "Not because you need permission to stay, but because it reminds us how every meaningful journey begins with trust." Amelia could no longer hold back the tears gathering in her eyes. She stepped closer and wrapped her arms around him, embracing him for the first time without hesitation or uncertainty. Ethan returned the embrace with quiet gratitude, holding her gently as though protecting the happiness they had built together one ordinary day at a time. Months later, visitors to Blackwood Manor often remarked on how peaceful the estate felt. They admired the beautiful gardens, the welcoming atmosphere, and the foundation's growing impact throughout the community. Few knew the true story behind the marriage that had brought it all together. They never learned that a frightened bride had once crossed those front doors expecting cruelty, only to discover compassion. They never realized that the most powerful promise Ethan Blackwood ever fulfilled was not written inside a contract, but carried faithfully within his heart. As Amelia looked around the home they had created together, she finally understood that love had never arrived through dramatic gestures or extraordinary moments. It had quietly appeared through patience, respect, freedom, and countless acts of kindness repeated every single day until two strangers became partners, two partners became family, and one unexpected promise became the place they would forever call home.